Chapter 1. The Letter from the Dead. Emily Hernandez had never believed in ghosts. The idea of spirits lingering after death had always seemed like a fantasy to her, a concept confined to horror movies and urban legends. She was a firm believer in logic, science, and the tangible reality of the world. But when she received a letter from her childhood friend, Claire Williams, everything changed. The problem was, Claire had been dead for 3 years. It had been an ordinary Tuesday evening when Emily found the letter waiting for her in the mailbox. The sun had just begun to set, casting a golden hue over the quiet suburban neighborhood. She had trudged up her driveway after a long shift at the bookstore, exhausted and eager to unwind. The stack of mail she collected was unremarkable: bills, advertisements, a grocery store coupon booklet. But the moment she saw the faded yellow envelope, her breath caught in her throat. It was old, its corners frayed and edges slightly torn. There was no return address, just her name, written in the familiar, looping handwriting she had not seen in years. Her hands trembled as she turned it over, hesitating before tearing it open. The letter inside was short but chilling. "Emily, I know this is hard to believe, but I need your help. I did not die in an accident. I was murdered, and I need you to bring my killer to justice. You were always the only one I could trust. Find the truth, Claire." Emily reread the letter, her pulse pounding in her ears. She blinked hard, willing her mind to make sense of the words. Her fingers clenched the paper, her nails digging into the fragile parchment. This had to be a joke, a cruel, sick prank. But who would do something like this? And how would they know Claire's handwriting so perfectly? A cold shiver ran down her spine as she stepped into the house, locking the door behind her. She tossed the rest of the mail onto the counter and moved to the kitchen, gripping the letter tightly, as if afraid it would vanish. She set it down and stared at it, the dim kitchen light casting shadows across the page. Claire's death had been ruled an accident, a tragic drowning in the lake near their hometown. The police had found no evidence of foul play. It had taken Emily months to come to terms with it, and now, this letter threatened to unearth everything she had buried deep within her heart. Taking a deep breath, she pulled out her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen. Who could she call? The police? No, they would never believe her. Even if they did, what evidence did she have beyond an old letter with a dead girl's name on it? Instead, she dialed a number she had not used in years. It rang 3 times before a groggy voice answered. "Hello. Josh, it's me," Emily said, her voice unsteady. Josh Carter had been Claire's high school sweetheart and Emily's closest ally when they were younger. He had taken Claire's death hard, disappearing from town not long after the funeral. She had not spoken to him since. "Emily." Josh sounded more awake now. "Is everything okay?" I got a letter," she said, glancing at the paper on the counter. "From Claire." There was silence on the other end. Then, a sharp intake of breath. "What are you talking about?" Emily swallowed. "It's in her handwriting, Josh. It says she was murdered." More silence. Then, in a voice laced with disbelief and something else, fear, Josh said, "I'll be there in an hour." By the time Josh arrived, Emily had read and reread the letter so many times she had memorized every curve and tilde of the words. She opened the door before he even knocked, and he stepped inside, shaking off the evening chill. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, his jaw clenched tight. "Let me see it," he said without preamble. Emily handed him the letter. He scanned it quickly, then again more slowly, his brow furrowing deeper with each passing second. "This can't be real," he muttered. "It has to be a fake." "But the handwriting." "I know," he sighed, running a hand over his face. "It looks exactly like hers." "But, Emily, Claire's been dead for 3 years." Emily folded her arms. "You think I don't know that? But what if? What if it's true? What if she was murdered? Josh hesitated. Then we need to find out who sent this. A heavy silence settled between them before Josh finally spoke again. Do you still have Claire's old things? Anything with her handwriting? Emily nodded. I kept some of her letters and notes from high school. I can compare them. She hurried to her bedroom, pulling a shoebox from the back of her closet. Inside were old photographs, trinkets, and folded-up letters from Claire, notes passed between classes, birthday cards, even a half-finished poem Claire had once written about their adventures as kids. She spread them out on the coffee table and placed the new letter beside them. The handwriting was identical, not just similar but exact. The way Claire formed her capital letters, the little flourishes on certain words, it was all there. Josh let out a slow breath. This is impossible. Or someone went to extreme lengths to make it look real, Emily said. But deep down, she wasn't sure she believed that anymore. A thought struck her. The postmark. She grabbed the envelope, flipping it over. The ink was smudged, but she could make out a date. 2 days ago. And the location. Their hometown, Lakewood. Josh met her gaze. We need to go back. Emily's stomach twisted. She had not set foot in Lakewood since Claire's funeral. The idea of returning filled her with unease, but she knew there was no other option. If Claire really had been murdered, then someone in Lakewood had kept that secret buried for 3 years. And now, someone wanted Emily to dig it up. Chapter 2. Unraveling the Past. Emily couldn't ignore the letter. The elegant, slanted handwriting burned into her memory, its words both cryptic and urgent. Someone out there knew the truth about Claire's death, something the police had dismissed as an accident. Her heart thudded with unease as she ran her fingers over the paper, the weight of the past settling over her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Claire had been her best friend since childhood, inseparable from their first meeting in the school cafeteria. Losing her had shattered Emily's world. The police had called it a tragic accident, blaming the rain-slicked roads and poor visibility. Emily had tried to accept that, to move on. But now, doubts clawed at her mind. What if Claire's death hadn't been an accident at all? Determined, Emily decided to dig into Claire's past. She started where any investigator would, the places that had once meant something to Claire. The coffee shop where they spent long afternoons cramming for exams. The bookstore Claire adored. The jogging path where she always cleared her mind. They all felt eerily unchanged, frozen in time, yet Claire's absence was palpable. Her first real lead came when she visited Claire's parents. They had never truly recovered from their daughter's death, and when Emily sat in their living room, surrounded by faded family photographs, she saw the pain still etched into their faces. Mrs. Holloway, do you remember if Claire ever mentioned anyone bothering her before she died? Emily asked, gripping her coffee cup tightly. Mrs. Holloway exchanged a glance with her husband. She was worried about something, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But she wouldn't tell us. We assumed it was just stress from work. She kept saying she felt watched. A chill crawled up Emily's spine. Did she mention a name? Mr. Holloway cleared his throat. No, but she was always looking over her shoulder. She even changed her locks a few weeks before the accident. That was new information. Claire hadn't told Emily any of this. Determined to uncover more, Emily retrieved Claire's old belongings from the attic, where her parents had stored them away. Among the stacks of books and clothes, she found a leather-bound diary tucked at the bottom of a box. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. Claire had written about someone named Daniel Cross. The name sent a shiver through Emily. The entries detailed a man who had fixated on Claire, sending her unwanted messages, watching her from a distance. She had gone to the police, but they had brushed off her concerns. Claire had written that she was scared, that she didn't feel safe. Emily inhaled sharply. Could Daniel Cross have had something to do with Claire's death? The police report had stated that Claire lost control of her car due to the rain and a sharp turn. But what if she hadn't been alone that night? What if someone had forced her off the road? Determined to learn more, Emily sought out Claire's old friends. Most of them had moved on, their grief faded into distant memories. But when she met with Claire's former co-worker, Lisa, she uncovered another disturbing piece of the puzzle. I remember Claire talking about a guy who creeped her out, Lisa said over a cup of coffee. She was scared of him, but she tried not to let it show. One time, he showed up at her workplace, just standing outside watching her. She was rattled, but the guy never did anything. At least not then. Emily clenched her fists. How had this been ignored? How had no one taken Claire seriously? She decided to track down Daniel Cross. A quick online search revealed his last known address. It was a small apartment complex on the outskirts of town. Emily drove there, heart pounding, unsure of what she'd find. The building was run down, the paint peeling from the walls. She hesitated before knocking on the door marked 4B. No answer. Peering through the small window beside the door, she noticed the room inside was mostly empty, save for stacks of newspapers and something that made her blood run cold. On the wall, there were photos. Dozens of them. All of Claire. Emily stumbled back, her breath hitching. This was more than just obsession. Daniel Cross had been watching Claire, documenting her every move. And if he had still been here, watching someone else, the floor creaked behind her. She spun around, heart hammering. A man stood at the end of the hallway, his sharp eyes locked onto her. Tall, with an unshaven face and hollow cheeks. The way he stared made her feel like prey. "Who are you?" he asked, voice low and rasping. Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. "I'm looking for Daniel Cross." The man's lips curled into a smirk. "You found him." Fear coiled in her stomach. She had to think fast. "I was a friend of Claire's," she said, watching for his reaction. His expression flickered, something unreadable in his eyes. Then he chuckled darkly. "Claire's gone," he said simply. Nothing left to dig up. Emily's pulse thundered in her ears. "You were following her. She was afraid of you." Daniel tilted his head, his smirk never faltering. She liked to imagine things. A lie. Claire's diary told a different story. Emily took a step back. "Did you see her the night she died?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her as if deciding whether to tell the truth. Then he leaned in slightly. "Some things are better left buried." Emily's breath caught. That wasn't the denial. She turned and walked swiftly toward the exit, resisting the urge to break into a run. As soon as she reached her car, she locked the doors and pulled out her phone, hands shaking. She had been right to reopen this case. Claire hadn't died in an accident. And now, Emily was in danger too. Chapter 3. The shadows close in. Emily tracked down Daniel Cross. He lived alone in a rundown apartment on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where secrets festered in the dark. The building was draped in a thin film of grime, its exterior paint peeling like dead skin. A dim streetlight flickered erratically outside, casting shadows that stretched and shrank against the cracked pavement. For days, Emily watched him from a distance, noting his nervous glances and hurried steps. He seemed paranoid, always checking over his shoulder, jumping at the smallest noises. He rarely spoke to anyone, kept his curtains drawn at all hours, and never stayed outside longer than necessary. It was as if he was expecting someone to come for him. Each evening, Emily grew more convinced of his guilt. Claire's diary, filled with raw pain and chilling details, had led her here. The letter she had found hidden between its pages had confirmed her worst fears. Claire had been in danger, and no one had listened. One night, she decided it was time. Armed with the diary and the letter, She climbed the rickety stairs to his apartment. The wooden boards groaned under her weight, and for a moment, she thought she heard movement inside. She hesitated, but the memory of Claire's trembling handwriting fueled her resolve. Taking a deep breath, she raised her fist and knocked. The sound of shuffling feet echoed inside. A moment later, the door creaked open. Daniel stood there, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. The dim light from the hallway illuminated the sweat beading on his forehead. "Why are you here?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Emily held up the diary, her fingers tightening around its worn cover. "I know what you did to Claire," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Tell me the truth." Daniel's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the doorframe. "I never meant for it to happen," he muttered, his voice cracking. I just wanted her to love me. But she rejected me, and I lost control." Emily felt her stomach twist. The words from Claire's letter rang in her ears. "He's watching me. I know he is. If something happens to me, it was him." "You killed her," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet laced with undeniable accusation. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, as if trying to escape the reality of his confession. "It wasn't supposed to go that far," he choked out. I wanted to talk to her. Just talk. But she kept pushing me away." She screamed. I panicked. And then, he trailed off, his breathing ragged. Emily swallowed the bile rising in her throat. "And then what?" His eyes darted around, wild and unfocused. I covered it up. I had to. No one would have understood. It was an accident. I swear." Emily's grip on the diary tightened until her knuckles turned white. "You will pay for this," she said, her voice firm with determination. "Justice will be served." Daniel's breathing grew rapid. "You don't understand," he hissed. "You think this is over? It's not. There are things, people, you don't even know about. If you keep digging, you'll regret it." A chill ran down Emily's spine. "What do you mean?" Daniel took a step closer, his eyes darting to the hallway as if making sure no one else was listening. "Claire knew something," he whispered. "Something bigger than me. Bigger than all of us. That's why she had to be silenced." Emily's heart pounded. "What are you talking about? What did Claire know?" Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the sound of heavy boots echoed from the stairwell. His face drained of color. "They know you're here," he breathed. "Run." Emily barely had time to process his words before a loud bang rattled the apartment door. A deep voice boomed from the other side. "Daniel Cross. Open up." Panic surged through her veins. She turned to Daniel, but he was already backing away, his eyes filled with fear. "Go," he urged. "Before it's too late." Emily hesitated only a second before bolting toward the fire escape at the end of the hall. The door burst open behind her as she pushed through the rusted metal exit, her breath coming in short gasps. As she climbed down the shaky ladder, she caught a final glimpse of Daniel being dragged out of his apartment, his eyes locking onto hers one last time before he disappeared into the shadows. Something was very, very wrong. Claire's murder wasn't just about obsession or rejection. There was something more, something dangerous lurking in the darkness. And Emily was next. Chapter 4. Justice from Beyond. Emily went straight to the police with the diary and Daniel's confession. This time they listened. With the diary's damning details and the weight of Daniel's own words, there was no room for doubt. The case, long thought to be a tragic accident, was reopened. Within days, Daniel was arrested, and the small town of Everbrook buzzed with the shocking revelation. The local news covered the case extensively, labeling it a breakthrough in justice for Claire Jennings. People who had once dismissed her death as an unfortunate accident now whispered about how eerie it was that a letter, seemingly from beyond, had led to the truth. Emily, exhausted but determined, sat through every interview with the detectives, recounting the strange circumstances that had pushed her to dig deeper. When she had first received the letter, she thought it was some sort of cruel joke. But the more she read Claire's diary, the more the words reached into her soul, forcing her to act. She couldn't ignore the desperate plea for justice. The night before Daniel's trial began, Emily sat by her kitchen table, staring at the letter that had started it all. The handwriting was elegant but rushed, as if written in a hurry. She traced her fingers over the ink. Had Claire truly reached out to her? Or had some unknown force ensured the truth would come to light? As she exhaled, a gust of wind rattled the window. A shiver ran down her spine. Ever since she'd received Claire's diary, strange things had been happening. Lights flickering, cold drafts, whispers just on the edge of hearing. Had Claire's spirit been guiding her? Emily shook her head and returned to her research. The more she read about Daniel, the more she realized how carefully he had hidden his dark side. He had always been charming, a local golden boy with a bright future. But Claire's diary had painted a different picture, one of manipulation, jealousy, and ultimately murder. The trial was held in the county courthouse, a looming stone building that had seen decades of justice and injustice. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back rows, their pens poised over their notepads, waiting to record every detail. Emily took her seat among Claire's remaining family. Her mother sat beside her, clutching a tissue, her hands trembling. She had spent 3 years believing that her daughter's death was an accident. Now, she would finally hear the truth. Daniel sat at the defense table, his once confident posture slightly hunched. His lawyer argued that the diary could have been fabricated, that there was no definitive proof tying him to Claire's death. But then came the confession, his own words, carefully recorded in his journal, outlining his guilt, his frustration, his belief that no one would ever find out. Emily watched as his face paled when the prosecution read aloud the incriminating passage. She wouldn't stop talking about leaving, about telling someone. I didn't mean to push her that hard. She should have just listened. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Claire's mother sobbed softly beside Emily, squeezing her hand. The weight of grief and vindication settled over the room. The trial lasted for weeks, but in the end, the jury found Daniel guilty of second-degree murder. The judge's gavel fell, sealing his fate. A hush filled the room. Justice had been served. That night, Emily returned home, exhaustion weighing heavy on her shoulders. She sank into her armchair, barely able to process everything that had happened. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that made her chest feel tight. Then she saw it. Another letter sat on her coffee table. Heart pounding, she reached for it. The envelope was the same as before, old-fashioned, slightly yellowed. With trembling fingers, she unfolded the paper. The message was short, just 2 words. Thank you. Beneath it, a name was signed. Claire. A soft breeze stirred the curtains, though the windows were closed. Emily felt a warmth settle over her, a feeling of peace unlike anything she had felt before. Tears welled in her eyes. Claire could finally rest. She pressed the letter to her chest and whispered, "You're welcome."